What's going on, guys? Hey, I got a great podcast for you today. I got my new friend Daniel Collier. Did I say that right? Of Sons of Light Training, and interestingly enough, he's local to me, and we connected on Facebook. And he's like, "Hey, I talk about the short season. I talk about the millennial reign and all the things." And he's like, "We should do a podcast." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Obviously, we should." So, welcome to the show, Daniel.
Hey, thank you. Glad to be here. Glad to be here.
Can you first just tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, like how you how you came to some of these conclusions, like maybe like what you're doing with your Sons of Light training, your YouTube channel, and
Yeah.
in the book you said that you wrote about this exact subject.
Yeah. So it's not something that I meant to discover per se, and it was a transition over time. I would say I was a normie Christian, basically
Mm-hmm.
the typical go to church person. And um, I went to seminary school. I was going to be a pastor at one time, and then for some reason there was certain things going on, discussions, limitations with what could be taught that didn't match up with things I believed from the Bible, and I didn't really want to be put under restriction. But I got started in all of this right after 9/11, 2001 was the
Okay.
instigation point. Like a lot of people, I was very, my biggest conspiracy theory thing and stuff was, believing in UFOs and maybe Bigfoot or something like that. But it was just
Yeah.
mildly interesting. I believed in all the spiritual things from the Bible, but not, it wasn't something I got super in depth into until that event took place. And then I began to discover, hey, something doesn't smell right here. And from that, it took me on a journey where I discovered there was some spiritual forces at work in all these weird events that have been taking place from that point all the way up till now. There was no way possible that it was just men involved in it. It was too complicated. And and from there, like everybody, once you start learning stuff, once you start heading down the rabbit hole, you learn more and more, and then the next thing you know, you question everything. And that's when you begin to really discover that history can't be trusted. What the mainstream news is nothing but lies. And so I've done I was a marketing and advertising major in college, which was one of the first things that set me off on knowing just how in depth magic and deception was used in everyday things, because
Right.
high level marketing and advertising is a use of spellcast, on people. So the average guy with the HVAC company, running an ad on TV is not involved in any of that. But when you get into like high level corporate advertisement, that is spellcast, just like the news. I mean, they're working to manipulate you, not only to sell a product, but they're working on selling an agenda and an idea and implant it in your brain where you think it's your own idea. So
Right.
that was another thing, because I had a professor who used to be in the CIA, and he got me interested in subliminal advertising and all that stuff. And so my mind was already open to knowing there was some deceptive practices going on.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until 9/11 happened that everything, all of a sudden, just stuff started tying together. And I remember during that time, it was still really big for television preachers to constantly be talking about the rapture, and they're selling books on all of this stuff, and the Antichrist and all of this stuff, and that was huge. But I started to doubt some of the things they were saying. So I made a very serious prayer to God, and I asked him to reveal to me how all of this stuff works. What was going on? How does all this work? What's really true about the book of Revelations? And I'm not sure. Sometimes I say, I'm not sure I should have made that prayer, because the
Right. Do you really
things that
want to
were
know?
revealed to me did not make me any friends.
Right.
People did not want to hear me telling them the truth. Nobody wanted to hear the conspiracy stuff at that time. And so anyway, that led me to writing a book combining all of this stuff about Hollywood using subliminal things in all their movies. It was a unveiling, like a revealing of the hierarchy. They were telling you the
Mm-hmm.
black magic that's going on, and that was their way of revealing it to you so that you would accept it. And so anyway, it was a myriad of things. I ended up writing a book that contained all of the stuff from 9/11 that was gematria and black magic, and how it's no way that it was a random event like they said. So the whole point of creating the book was because I got so much backlash from the normies out there just
Right.
denying everything. I mean, they'd have a counter argument for everything from spiritual stuff. So I wrote the book to include such a good argument that, once they read it or once they heard the material, they would just really feel stupid for trying to counteract it, even being a normie. You know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah.
and then the second part of it was I was very big at that time into counteracting all of the, the things where people had arguments, like atheists would say, oh, I don't believe in a big sky grandfather, and they would talk about
Mm-hmm.
evolution and all. So I took all the typical points that someone would make to deny Jesus, to say the Bible wasn't trustworthy, all that stuff, and created the counter arguments with proof, historical stuff, whatever may be needed, like, to counter evolution. I gave the statistical probability of evolution occurring, and it was just, by the time you get done with it, you feel stupid trying to say I believe
Right.
in evolution. So that was the point of the book, was to give people a reason to believe in God, in Jesus, the Bible, and that there was an actual enemy doing all this crazy stuff like you and I talk about, like undeniable. There's no way that
Yeah.
the stuff they're telling you isn't a conspiracy. You almost feel dumb saying it, believe
No,
me.
I know exactly what you mean, because
Yeah,
the interesting part about it is that if we believe in a God of order, well, the opposite is basically everything happens by random chance. So we
right.
believe in a sovereign God. We believe that, based on what the Bible says, the devil's allowed to do certain things, but it's only because God allows them. So everything is not just some accident.
No.
So if we believe that, there'd be evidence of it, right? There'd kind of be proof that there is kind of a cyclical nature. There would be a pattern of the things, and I just can't help but think like that. I'm one of these people who woke up in 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that there's probably a generation that's just 20 years before us. Yeah, like, so it's 2000, 9/11, 2001
Yeah,
is
that was when I started to wake
the
up.
one generation wakes up then. But it was funny because, like, when that happened, in I was like just out of college,
Yeah,
and I probably was, obviously I was still looking for the white picket fences. I was still looking for all the American dream stuff. So, like,
yeah,
I did not want to. I would never have looked into it then. I would never have been open to it. And it wasn't until 2020 is when I was like, I to finally being willing to go back and look at 9/11, because I remember the with the Fahrenheit 9/11 stuff, the loose change, and I always thought, well, that's an attack on the Republicans, and I'm
yeah,
like grew up as a conservative
yeah,
guy.
yeah,
So, like, so I mean, so that's what I would look. Oh, you want John Kerry to get elected if you're saying these kind of things.
yeah. I had to. I
But of
do the.
course, now I look back and I'm like, gosh, I can't believe I ever defended anybody with the last name Bush. Oh my gosh, like, I've had to repent of that so much.
Look, me too. It wasn't until I started getting in depth into this research, and I believe God revealed things to me.
Hmm.
That all I knew about the Bush family, like you said, was what I was told about them through the propaganda that came from television. And
Right.
then I learned that they weren't such a good family. In fact, they were involved in a lot of bad stuff. So,
Those left wingers were not wrong about everything they said about them. I look back,
no,
I'm like, gosh, they were right about a lot of it. And
yeah,
I was just, yeah, it's kind of like that's. But I started to see, like, when I got to where we are now, that, yeah, two wings of the same bird. If you divide and conquer, so they're going to make politics team sports. So therefore, you're going to defend your guy no matter what because it's your team.
Right.
Meanwhile, it's like
Yeah.
they're using both sides in order to squeeze us all in the middle.
I was just like you where, I call it being a normie because I was a normie in that instant. I was caught in the paradigm where it was my team and it was Team Republican and it was, and everybody else was trying to
Mhm.
wreck America because they were communist. And
Right,
I was
right.
caught in that paradigm, and everything was because, still from the 80s where it's all Russia communist, or whatever.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
but that was a construct that was it was a construct I didn't know any better to question, probably from public school and whatever else indoctrination I was given. But I think God, once you get saved and you allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you and you listen, suddenly you start to wake up. You're like, okay, well, I understand there's evil. So I need to look for what are the signs that are being revealed to me on either side that don't match up with the Bible.
Right.
Whether it's somebody claiming to be a Christian, but they kind of dance around how they answer that question, how politicians
Mhm.
do. And you're like, well, that guy's not really a Christian because a Christian is proud to come right out and say, yes, I am. I'm a Christian. And let me tell you,
Right.
Jesus,
Mhm.
they don't dance around it like the politicians do.
I was thinking about it too, like that, like how you were saying that once you started to kind of study the Bible yourself, you were noticing you couldn't talk about certain things, and I'm a pretty good example of that. That I said I grew up in a Christian home, went to Christian schools, graduated from Liberty University,
Mhm.
and then once I finally like started reading the Bible without any guidance, like I'm reading it by myself, I'm reading it because I need it, and I'm like, I realize everything I've been taught almost is a lie, so I'm going to finally trust this for real.
Hmm.
And I started reading and I'm like, man, I don't remember this being in here. And I don't remember ever being taught this. And I don't remember that, like, why did we do things in my church this way when the Bible says this? And yeah, and then you start to like, yeah. So once you start to say, well, everybody realizes the news lies to you, everybody realizes the politicians lie to you, then at some point you realize maybe the teachers are lying to me or they're teaching us lies.
Yeah.
But then when you realize they're telling us lies from the pulpit,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure why. And obviously, in each instance is likely different. But point being is like we're not being taught the truth. And then when you start trying to say the truth, like you're saying that when you're asking God to reveal things to you, yeah, like we just talked about this recently that it's kind of like if God told you something's true that was uncomfortable, would you really want to know? Because then that forces some kind of a change in you. And I think that's the whole reason people are normies is because it's not because they're stupid, it's because they're willfully ignorant. Because I've got this thing, I don't want to ruin my Friday night with hearing bad news. I
Yeah.
don't want to wreck my good time by hearing something that makes me uncomfortable. So if God reveals something that's uncomfortable, yeah, you know that it's going to change your life. And if you're willing to let it change your life, obviously it's the best, nobody regrets that. But yeah, at the same time, like, yeah, knowing some of the things and like, yeah, like there's not a church I can go to. And obviously, we live in the same town. I'm sure maybe you have a tip, but like, there's not a brick and mortar church that I feel comfortable in because I just don't like, it's either I read my Bible enough on my own that I don't need to be taught certain, like the same kind of lessons over and over
The
again,
same
or
lesson
it's
over.
or they're giving us like half truths or something like that, or like it's 80% of a good message, and I'm just like, where's the meat in this?
Yeah. I mean, I went to, for as far as churches, I went to a lot of churches looking for a place to go. And, after a while, one of the things I couldn't stand was the music.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in college, I was in a band and stuff. So I was very into music. But as I started to research, this music thing goes back a very long time. Even Plato and Aristotle, you can find writings about how it would say the wrong kind of music can corrupt a society and things like that. And then as I stumbled across a lot of, learning things about where rock and roll music came from, how it got started, I ran
Yeah.
across, whether it's fully true, a guy named John Todd, who was, involved in, he was a high level witch who got converted and became a Christian, and he worked for a high level music agency, knew all the rock bands from the 60s and stuff. And he gave a lot of talks about how before all the master copies were made, they do a big ritual and attach demons to go out with the records. And
I've heard that. That was one of the things where I watched that they sold their souls for rock and roll,
yeah,
and and I remember seeing like in like way back in the day, like the '80s kind of Christian stuff. It was like Hell's Bells, and I remember being like kind of laughing about that when I was a kid, and then I
yeah,
watched that, and I was blown away. Like, okay, because they tied everyone to a Lester Crowley, and then
yeah,
then I continued to go down the rabbit hole, and then I was like, wait a minute. So obviously, if they're influencing the music in this kind of way, then we already know they're doing it in the movies,
yeah,
and then we know what kind of politicians you have, and you're like, and I remember like it was like one of those like I got the chills when I was like, so it's everywhere then, and
yeah, yeah,
That's when I really realized, yeah, they are using spells on us, and obviously a lot of the music is channeled. Demons are channeling, they're
mm-hmm,
channeling demons to write the music, become great musicians, and then they're using it to influence us. And now I start to understand like what songs like Revolution were really about.
yeah.
Like we're going to change the world, and always thought like that's just some kind of hippie slogan. You're like, no, they really meant that.
Well, you know what's crazy? I remember watching that same documentary. And when I started learning all this stuff, I was very into music. I wasn't like a crazy fanatic, but I loved music. And, I remember learning stuff about Elvis, who everybody almost worshiped, even Christians.
Right.
Oh, Elvis was a good.
The Christian guy, right? Elvis,
Yeah.
right?
And, it was very shocking to me to have to accept that the demon stuff on albums or the things they were talking about wasn't a joke. In fact,
Yeah.
they played it off as like, oh, it's just rebel rock and roll stuff, but they were it wasn't a joke at all. They were
Mhm.
seriously it was serious witchcraft things and evil things using music to influence and really destroy a lot of people. Um, and the influence is so great, it embeds in your spirit. I tell people all the time, I write about this in my book on a section about music where they know that it embeds like in a mathematical code, it will embed into your psyche. And, if you've ever had a trauma or you ever go through a serious relationship problem or something, and all of a sudden you're kind of depressed and you don't know why, the lyrics to some song from the 70s or the 80s, some song you forgot, all of a sudden just comes back completely and it's negative,
Right.
depressing. And then there it is. And you're like, I forgot all about that song. And there it is playing, like almost trying to get you in a more depressed state. Whereas it didn't affect you before, but now you're vulnerable. Here's this like sub program coming up, and they know that. That's the spell of it. Yeah.
You were saying the music though in like modern churches.
The churches, yes. So I'll give you for an example, and I think this will make good sense for you. They changed the music over in the 70s. I think I did a video on this where when they began all the rock and roll movement with the Beatles and all this stuff, and the CIA and MI5 were really involved in getting all this stuff and the drug culture. These
Mhm.
bands didn't just miraculously come together and become really famous and all gather in California.
Right.
That was staged for a very evil thing to overtake Christianity. It was part of the movement to, and they started off with Elvis, and because they could at that time things were still really racist, so they needed a white guy to bring in this kind of voodoo drum beat stuff that would not be acceptable to begin
Mhm.
the movement through the 50s and stuff and get this, because music can destroy a society. And so they moved through that to the rock and roll culture, but at the same time they began this whole Jesus love movement. It's when they
Right.
started to change to the church from the traditional churches to this like hippie bus rock and roll culture movement within the church. And what they did is introduce the rock beats, the vibratory cycles, the voodoo-y drums, and they introduced the hertz and the cycles of the rock and roll music, but they put like a gospel track to it. So it's like telling somebody that you love them in an angry tone. Like if I say to someone, "Hey, I love you," that's nice. But if I say, "I love you," right? It has no
Mhm.
an opposite meaning. So imagine you have this negative rock and roll vibratory beat going, right? It's angry. It's at a cycle that disrupts your body somewhat. And yet you're singing about Jesus. So you're attaching Jesus to this negative vibratory cycle. And so that now you're in, it's very deep, but it implants a psychological negative message about it. Even though people can't understand it's happening, they're like, "Oh, I love worship music. It puts me in a good mood." But it can't because of the negative vibratory cycle of the rock music attached to it. Even when I'm sure you've learned when they changed over the music cycle, they claim the Nazis did it, but they changed the hertz of the
Mhm.
music from 440 to 442 or whatever it was, and they used
I
to
think
call it,
was it 440 to 430, or was it 432 is
yeah,
the healing type
yeah, healing, and
megahertz?
so they changed all of that, and so it's the same thing they implanted during the 70s with the whole rock and roll music. They did it to the church. So now that you have this, and I was a member, I was involved in Hillsong Church for a time, and then I bailed out because I was like, this isn't me. But they were very much into introducing all of this modern type of Christian music with the repetitive verses, very different than when I went to church as a kid.
Mhm.
But anyway, yeah, the rock and roll music with the attachment of the gospel to it it's a spell cast, and I know a lot of people won't like that, but like I say, I've had a lot of time. Just so, like, if you watch that documentary, stuff about music is way different than you really think it is.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying. Like, because I think that when I was presented with it, especially when I was in school, and I might be giving that old documentary "Hell's Bells" a bad name because they weren't wrong. They weren't wrong saying that these bands were satanic, but it was kind of more like they would say that Kiss meant knights in Satan's service or something like that,
Yeah,
and Gene Simmons would be like, "You idiot Christians! It's just supposed to be some kind of a sexual reference is the way they call it."
it could be.
He could be telling the truth or he could be lying. I guess the point was is that I it doesn't nobody's impressed when you tell them that AC/DC's satanic. Like we would be like, oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think that because it's funny how the normies will do this. Will be like, oh well, they're doing it for shock value. So even if they're really blatantly satanic, it's like they're not they don't really mean it. They're just
Yeah,
doing it to make you
for
guys
sure.
uncomfortable.
Yeah, that was like,
And then so if it's really subtle, they would be like, "Oh, you guys are reaching." But I think that that's the thing. It's like I like things to make sense. And when they started to show that all of these people were influenced by Lester Crowley,
yeah.
and first establish who he is and
Mm-hmm.
how bad he was, and then you think like these bands singing about love, and then they're disciples of this guy. Okay, so now I was actually like, okay, now I'm actually really surprised because yeah, bands like the Beatles, bands like the Rolling Stones, Elvis.
Yeah.
Um, the craziest one I think was Led Zeppelin because
Oh, yeah.
yeah, I guess it's like you're not really paying attention to what they're saying because their lyrics are usually really bizarre. But
Yeah.
when I started to hear about was it
Backmasking stuff.
Jimmy Page? Well, not just the backmasking, was just the connection between them and Aleister Crowley. So
Yeah.
Jimmy Page buys Aleister Crowley's old house that was on Lake Loch Ness,
Yeah.
and this is crazy. I don't know if you heard this story, but so the house, I forgot what it was called. Gosh, I forget there's a special name for the house, but there's mythology saying that Aleister Crowley was really the Loch Ness monster. So he was on this lake. They were doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So where this house was, there used to be an old church,
Uh-huh.
and the church burned down with the congregation inside of it.
What?
Yes, yes. So the congregation was inside the church, and so those people were buried on the property. And so they said that they built this church, they built this house on top of this place, and then there was actually like a some kind of a way to get out from the house down to the graveyard that was in the backyard of the property.
So there's like a tunnel or something.
Yeah, there was to get down to like the crypt. I mean, and so
Oh, it's
then
creepy.
so this guy, Jimmy Page, obviously of Led Zeppelin,
Yeah.
he also bought a magic shop that was once Lester Crowley's.
Hmm.
So now you're talking about like, okay, so this is not just this is not innocent. And
Yeah.
even I think it was so Lester Crowley sold that house because the people died in it that were connected with him. I think
Hmm.
Jimmy Page had somebody died that was connected with him in that house. The guy who bought it from Jimmy Page killed himself. Um, like, you know what I mean? Like that's the kind of stuff. And it's like, so you understand that the music that this guy's making, he's not even trying to hide how he makes the music.
No.
And do you ever hear the story? What was it? Kenneth Anger, who did a movie called Lucifer Rising.
Yeah.
Jimmy Page was supposed to write the music for it. Well, that guy was mad that he didn't give him enough music, and so Kenneth Anger put a curse on Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page basically never made any good music ever again after that. And there was people connected with the band who obviously John Bonham died, and all the things that
Yeah.
happened after that, and people say was that from that curse.
I know that Kenneth Anger was involved with Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, and
Hmm.
it's the same type of thing. Remember, like the old albums from like the Rolling Stones, and they would just be blatantly have albums like "Sympathy for the Devil" and these songs and stuff, and people were so disassociated from that it was serious business to them. But to the outside world, they were like, oh, they're just being rebel and anti-establishment. And then, like, to me and you, we learned that no, it was serious business. They were really trying to put spells on people and some of them were even indoctrinated witches and stuff. You had no idea about that. I didn't know. And
How did you go from like the typical, you know, churchianity thing in America of we're waiting on this invisible rapture before the tribulation starts and then all the bad stuff is going to happen, all the way to the point of did Jesus already come back and
yeah,
everybody's missed it?
well, that thing only happened within the past few years, starting to question that because I was still, that was beating my head for a very long time with the rapture
Hmm.
and, the whole book of Revelation thing. I think what allowed me to come to that revelation was so many things over and over and over again being a conspiracy to manipulate everyone and hide things, and I was like, this is really evil. And then I started to reevaluate because I knew when I was in church and I was even in seminary school with stuff that the church was pushing things on me that I didn't believe. And then there was stuff like, you look in the book of Genesis when it talks about the giants and the Nephilim and all that. And then the church is, trying to teach you as a pastor to teach a message that it was just mighty men and kings and stuff. And you're like, well, that's not really what it says.
Right.
So I slowly got out of mainstream church. I just couldn't take it anymore, from the music to the messages. And then knowing that half the time the pastor was just getting a pre-made sermon, and just each week he'd already have a sermon made and he'd go up there and just read whatever came down from that denomination or something. I'm like, this isn't working.
It's funny you say that because I can't remember who I was just talking to about that because I was saying because I started to learn a little bit more about this stuff. I didn't realize that there's all these uh, organizations that plant churches in places, and then all these churches are under these certain people.
Yeah.
And then if you see a sermon that you thought was good, you could probably find that sermon on YouTube somewhere else because
Yeah.
there was like they got the script like all kinds of other churches in that branch of churches.
Yeah.
And
There's a
that blew somebody's mind because I was like, yeah, those people are like, I saw there was a church, and I don't know if you know who these are, but I won't even go in their names. But they were preaching about Taylor Swift's song "It's Me," and because the funny part was, I did a video about breaking down like her music video, saying this song's about demon possession,
Yeah.
and so this church organization was preaching this message as in Well, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me. So therefore, obviously, God's the solution. But the song actually has a good message because it's taking like accountability for yourself. And I'm like, no, that song is the it's me is the demon
Yeah,
singing it's me. And I
yeah.
said, this is not a godly. And it's funny. I posted on their Instagram page. They deleted the comment, and then I remember seeing later on YouTube that there was other really prominent pastors preaching the exact same message. And I'm like, okay, so
It's a theme
now
now.
I get
Yeah,
it.
it's a theme. I saw one where this pastor was preaching on a Beyonce song. And I'm thinking, like, what is it that you've missed? She says she has, she's possessed by this demon called Sasha Fierce. You know, what is it you're preaching this message about her song being tied to a biblical message or something? I'm like, so it's a theme, I think, um, a very deceptive theme to get people to start blending.
Well, I think it's also, I mean, at the very least, it could be you have this seeker friendly churches. You make a message that makes no one uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Everybody in the church listens to Taylor Swift and Beyonce, so therefore you're not offending any of them. And then at the end of the day, they come home thinking like, oh well, I'm good to listen to this song on the way home. I'm gonna throw an extra 50 in the offering plate, and then
Yeah.
everybody wins, right? Like I think that that's probably likely why they do it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the typical. They started that years ago where they were like, oh, well, we're losing people from the church and stuff. So we need to bring in the young crowd. And, you know, that started in the 70s when I was talking about that whole movement that started and then got worse as it moved through the 80s and 90s where they were like doing the seeker friendly churches. Because I went to a
Hmm.
seeker friendly church for 2 years and they never once had an altar call or asked anybody if they wanted to accept Jesus. It took me a while being absent from the mainstream church beating this false message into my head about certain doctrines for me to decompress, I think, because, you know, it works on people to get them to believe a certain thing. And then if you believe or question something, you're going to disappoint God or you're going to be lesser of a Christian. That's the trickery in the whole message. And
Hmm.
I think the demons and whoever else, Satan, knows this and knows, you know, like the Christians think they can't be deceived once they get saved. And I tell them, you know, if you read in the book of Revelation, it said, if possible, even the elect would be deceived, and the elect are Christians.
Hmm.
You can be deceived if you allow, your soul might be saved, but you can, obviously, Christians can be deceived because most of them are deceived by a lot of stuff. And that's
Yeah.
part, it's like your mission. I know it's your mission. It's my mission to kind of say, hey, maybe question this. Maybe this is what when Jesus was talking to the people standing in front of him and he said, some of you won't taste death before you see me return. Maybe he was
Right.
telling the truth. You know, maybe the church doing all this mental theological jump rope to get you to think it's 2,000 years later. Maybe he just told them the truth, you know? So,
Amen.
yeah.
Amen. Well, that's the funny. That's one of those things where I was saying that it wasn't until I was willing to accept that he meant what he said that I
Hmm.
could finally like say, "Oh gosh, it's so nice to actually not have to try to tie myself in knots in order to explain what he said." Because then you go into, was it Matthew 10:23 when he says, "You will not have gone around all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes."
Yeah.
Okay, so please try to explain that to me like he didn't mean them in that context. He didn't mean two.
Yeah.
It doesn't take 2,000 years to go around the towns of Israel. We know that.
No. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So the pastors were trained after the Schofield Bible and stuff came, they were trained to preemptively program the American people and the world, the churches of the world. I'm not talking about the Catholic Church. That's a whole nother spectrum, but I'm talking about like the Protestant churches. Uh, these young pastors were taught to go out and preemptively program everybody to believe a certain narrative. To, you know, like a young Christian comes in, so they would teach them what this chapter or this verse or what Matthew was writing about. They would tell them what he was writing about before they read it. So when they read it, they already believed the narrative in that light rather than what was actually said. I was
Hmm.
guilty of it. I fell for it. You know, I didn't even know any better.
Yes.
So, I mean, yeah, we all were. So, yeah.
No, that's what I said. I've often talked about that when it's like trying to kind of unlearn some of the things, or
Yeah.
just it's very difficult to read your Bible without bias. Like in the subconscious, you were told things about it. It was funny. I just did a podcast talking about this, and the sister that I was doing the podcast with, she was talking about she was going to write some little Bible study about the flood, and she was
Yeah.
saying she was talking about, like, she already had this part picked out of like when Noah was being mocked for making the boat and all this kind of stuff, and then she was like, "Wait a minute, that's actually not in the Bible."
Yeah.
You can kind of infer that it could have happened. Obviously, him
Yeah.
building a boat for about 70 years, maybe they would, or 100 years, however long it took him, like that maybe people were mocking, but that's literally not in the Bible. Like
Yeah.
that's
That was
what
just, yeah,
you're
that
taught
was,
more about the things you're taught about the flood of Noah is actually not what the Bible says about it. You're taught these things that people infer about it, and they paint a very vivid picture of, like, more about the animals than the giants and the Nephilim and all
yeah, the whole
the
reason
corrupt
the world was
bloodlines
getting
that
destroyed.
actually really caused this thing. And so people never really know why it was. Oh, people were really bad. Well, people have always been pretty bad. Like, so to what level does it cause God to literally destroy the whole earth with the
Yeah. Well,
flood?
they leave out the whole part about the genetic manipulation of men and things like that.
Yes.
Skip that part and just say men were wicked. They leave out the part about the Nephilim and stuff creating chimera and altering the genetic code and sinning against the birds of the air and the fish of the sea
Yep.
and all that. They leave that out or manipulate what it really meant. I
Well,
understand
it
why.
says what it actually says in Genesis, and this is not even just in Enoch. It says that all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when so now when you understand, like, what that actually meant, not it means, like, yeah, that people might not even been people at that point. Obviously, when it says Noah was pure in his generations, now
Yeah.
you get it. He was
Now you
pure
get it.
in his generations back to Adam, back to
Yes.
the first man.
That's right.
He doesn't have any corrupt DNA, and it's like that actually makes sense now, right?
Yeah. To carry on the lineage of the promise, the promise God made to bring a savior through Jesus, and it would be a pure bloodline from Adam. Well, if the Nephilim got their way, if the fallen angels got their way, they would have corrupted even Noah's line and ended that possibility, because now it would be a different seed line. There would be no savior
Mm-hmm.
who could come of pure lineage from God's creation. I think that's
That's
what they're
right.
up to now with all this transhumanism stuff. It's about these fallen angels, it's Satan. They hate humans. They hate us, maybe, and I think that's they want to create. They want to give Jesus no reason to return for anything, even
Mm-hmm.
for judgment, corrupt everything. And once that happens, there's no reason. This is their thinking. I'm thinking that they're trying to corrupt everything, make man with machines and hybrids, and where people are no longer a man or a woman, and they corrupt everything. And there's no reason. It's their world now. And there's no reason for Jesus to. There's no one for Jesus to return for. That's
Right.
my theory.
So once you started to recognize, like, the clear passages when Jesus is saying, my return is imminent, you
Hmm.
guys are going to see it. When did you tie that with possibly the mud flood and Tartaria, the old world? Because I think that was one of those things where, like, it wasn't. I've been making conspiracy type videos for about 3 years now,
Hmm.
and even that seems a little like those topics seem kind of new to me. I mean, maybe I obviously I haven't really. I was aware of them, but I felt like my focus was other places, so I really didn't dig too deeply into it till when people started to making those connections. Hey, what if these advanced looking buildings were actually made in a very advanced time, and that was recently? And then, yeah, it was almost like light bulb. Wait a minute, that actually makes a lot of sense, and,
I think
like,
I
digging
was
into it.
like you. It was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I was watching. I'm fascinated by old. My family goes back like 3 generations in construction and building.
Hmm.
Doing neighborhoods and whatever. And so I'm fascinated by architecture and old stuff. And I was watching videos on YouTube. They weren't Christian-based videos. They were just videos about all these old structures and how they possibly may not be what they said they were for, and how there was ones all over the United States, and it wasn't even getting into castles and stuff at that time. It was just like, things in Arizona, and you're like, that looks like a melted building. And
Yeah.
so I got really into this. I'd find myself at 3 o'clock in the morning still watching some video on all these images from all around the world of things that they told us were, they said they were volcanic creations, and then you're looking at it and you're like, that looks like a tree stump, or
Yes.
here's
Yep.
this thing that looks like a giant human in stone, and it's, it wasn't carved, so what's that doing there? And then there would be all these buildings, and you're like, well, I think it was a lot of megalithic stuff at first. When I was like, nah, we don't have a crane or any way to get this. We don't have a dump truck that can move this. How? So I started with the megalithic stuff, fascinated with that, and it moved into eventually the buildings and things from all around the world, and then it became castles. And then I really started looking, there was images of the inside of these castles and organs, and then I remember seeing this castle, and they showed the floor of the castle. And then they showed a circuit board, a modern day circuit board right next to it, and they were identical. And I was like, all right, stop the press right here. Hang on a second.
That's quite a coincidence, right?
Yeah, I mean, identical. And how did they make it with a bronze chisel and an ox cart? And, so it began, I was like, oh, hang on a second. And then a scripture came to me where Jesus said, in my house, there are many mansions. And I said, okay, well, if he was coming back and he said, there's going to be many mansions, then that's starting to tie in maybe where all these mansions and castles came from. I can't prove it, but that's making sense to me now.
Did that ever give you pause? Because I think at one point there was two things, and this is before I really did my own research. It sounds like I had a very similar mind to you. Is that I started watching that show Ancient Aliens, and it wasn't because I believed in aliens. I was really fascinated with all these structures all around the whole world, megalithic structures that I'd never heard of, and I was like, man, and I was watching these shows. I was watching these shows late at night. Yeah, so everybody knows about the Giza Plateau, but there's stuff like that everywhere, all around the whole world. And I was like, wow. So I remember thinking, so wait a minute. So you have certain people like, on Joe Rogan, like the Graham Hancocks of the world. I remember used to have John Anthony West on, and they would have these timelines, and they would date things like 10,000, 12,000, 20,000 years ago. And I remember thinking, well, where does the Bible have answers for this? Because obviously we know we have like the lineages, and the genealogy say the world's about 6,000 years old from the times of Adam. And so I started to like really, it bothered me that there was no good answers for this stuff. And then, it wasn't until recently obviously then I said I discovered Genesis 6. I discovered the book of Enoch. I'm like, okay, so these people are saying giants built these things. They're talking about having contact with gods. They're probably talking about the angels, the watchers, the sons of God. And so like that was, so I finally like, okay, that makes sense. It makes sense why we don't know more about them, because there was a giant flood. Any kind of writings about these things probably would have been destroyed during this flood. But then you get to like the stuff that if there is a advanced civilization, like, some people just call it Tartaria, like very recently. Okay, so what do you do with that biblically? Because that's really weird, because that actually was like mud flood. Okay, so then you have people who are not Christians saying, well, there's resets, just like the Mayans said that the earth was destroyed several times. It was destroyed at that time too. And it has something to do with the controllers. The controllers are going to pull the lever one day, and then we're going to this is going to be wiped out.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking like, I didn't really believe it, but I didn't have a good answer that they were wrong, because the Bible doesn't mention that, or at least I didn't think it did.
Yeah. Some of the things perplex me now because, I'm still decompressing from all the things I learned my whole life. And then
Hmm.
All of this is such a mystery because obviously it's meant to be a mystery because I think they've hidden books. They I I listened to an interview the other day, and the guy was, so there was a 108-year-old woman in this. He was talking about this woman, and it's something about flat Earth they were talking about. And she, all of a sudden, she perks up and she said, "Oh yeah, I remember when I was a little girl. They used to teach that in school. But then one day, some men came and they took all the books, and then they asked us if we had any books at home with this information in it." So at some point in time in the early 1900s, they were collecting books about, whether it's Christian Science or things about flat Earth that they taught then.
Probably real history books.
Yes. There was a conspiracy about the Rockefellers doing stuff with that and changing school, but that's a long subject to get in now. But yeah, they
Well, I
did.
mean, as Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller is like credited with creating like the modern school system. So
Yeah, yeah.
it just so happens that we're taught that the robber barons created everything that was good in this country during like the Industrial Revolution, right?
I believe all of those people, the Rockefellers and all these people, there's something, the stories they tell us about them and things like that, there's something more. I think it goes back either someone in the family sells their soul, type of thing, or there's something more to their connection to getting into the positions they're in, because you always find they're always involved in some kind of high occult symbolism and systems and things you and I don't know about at first, and you kind of have to learn about it later. I'll give you a weird story. So Rockefeller wanted the Twin Towers built in New York, and so in 1967, they were making plans to build these towers and stuff. So I don't know if it was his publication or not, but he's on the cover, and they make sure he's on the cover and he's smiling, and you see like the blueprint of the towers. But then you can clearly see his watch, and the hands of his watch are on 9/11.
I've seen that. That's
Yeah. And on the back cover is the same thing with a clock or something in the background, and hands on 9, and then it's on 11 past 9. So it's still 9/11. That's not an accident. That's a and then he owned AT&T and was involved in getting 9/11 established as the emergency number. So that's kind of, you're getting into some weird stuff where these people are operating in this kind of strange occult stuff we never were taught about, but they obviously grow up or learn about somehow. And I think it's like spellcast. It keeps everybody asleep in like normie land, where I was asleep at one time, but I didn't know about all of this stuff. It's weird.
It's my belief now that the secret societies, so obviously the Freemasons are the ones that get talked about most often.
Yeah.
That they're credited with creating a lot of the best buildings. And it's like, now I've realized, they took credit for building.
They took credit,
but I don't think there's any evidence that they built. Right. So what they really built was a system of lies and a hidden agenda. Because I think that like now you understand, like maybe these people like that these buildings were founded. Okay, now it makes sense. Like what they were founded in
the
this
word
day.
Is trick, right? They trick founded.
Right. I mean, it's funny. Like you don't. I mean, I guess you'd have no reason to think that these buildings weren't built when they said that they were until you look into it, and it just doesn't make sense. I said that was the thing that really I felt like the history we've been taught was exposed naked when you start looking into America, because we're taught about this very narrow timeline. So like those buildings in Europe, like I don't know what happened in Europe. I'm not from there. And like, so if they said they built these buildings and it took a long time and there's buildings, very similar ones all over Europe, it sort of makes sense to you. It's still impressive, obviously, till you actually really think about it. But when you see this stuff in America, and that was when I started to say like, okay, the pyramids are weird. But what's really weird? All the state capitol buildings that don't really match up. Like, why did they build like something that was straight out of ancient Rome, like for their emperor in Iowa, or in Nebraska, like in these times where it's like
2,500 people live in a town somewhere that's formed, and they build a post office that has 700 rooms and is like an ancient castle. like these people, these 2,500 people could just leave their farms and whatever and take, you know, it's the same like with the Mormon temple where they said they went out to Utah and they built this
Right.
almost, you know, with horse and buggy and nobody else out there. And they supposedly built this wonder of the world castle with no rails and no dump trucks and no cranes. And it goes down 40 to 60 feet underground with more building. And
Even think about like, so the 1 year timelines, and a lot of these buildings are 1 year wonders where they created this very elaborate stone building in 1 year.
yeah,
And the thing about it is, just knowing, like I said, it sounds like you got a construction background. My family has owned a construction company since I was, before I was even born. And knowing when you're working in the winter, and of course we live in Virginia, which is
yeah,
like the winters can be mild and stuff. But then you think about some of these places that have 1 year timelines, and then they work in like
permafrost.
Albany, Syracuse,
Yeah.
New York, these crazy places like that. And how, explain to me how much work they're getting done in the dead of winter
In that
in a
time
place
frame,
like that.
ancient time. Yeah.
When the roads would have been horrible, then you add snow on it, and then the logistics make no sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
you even think, like I said, go back to World War II, that we're told that the Germans were not necessarily defeated by the Russian army. They were defeated by the Russian winter.
Yeah.
Because even with the high-tech German stuff, they couldn't even move the equipment in during a harsh Russian winter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that is like the highest tech stuff in the 40s. And then you're talking about these things were built with horses and buggies in the 1840s. Okay,
Yeah. No power
that
tools.
don't
Yeah. No
that
power
makes no
tools.
sense to me.
Yeah. And no infrastructure. Like, let's say they went out to Utah and it's just forest. I mean, how long would it take them just to clear fields to grow crops? Nonetheless, go and build this like wonder of the world castle for, right? Like, it would take you years just to clear all your fields to grow crops and get the stumps up. And, you know, if you've ever tried to get a tree stump up with even a tractor or something, you can spend a long time. Imagine trying to cut down a forest and then haul stones, and it's like star forts now. Star forts all around America and stuff. That's a joke
Yeah,
to me too.
that's
Like, come on, seriously, in the 1700s, you're telling me that these wooden ships, they could load them down with that much, block
millions
and
of
stuff.
bricks.
Yeah.
Millions of bricks. Millions.
It's like, I forget the name of it, in just off of Key West. There's that
Oh, I was going to mention that Fort Jefferson.
Fort Jefferson, yeah, and that has to be millions of bricks. And so you mean to tell me a World War II, a Civil War vessel, you could load it down in the middle and sail out to a place with no water and build that complete structure during that time with that equipment? And for what reason? They said they never really even used it. Use it as a prison.
Right. Well, it was funny. I remember talking to my dad about that because, okay, so they built this in 1846. I just looked it up. 16 million bricks. Okay, so here's the craziest thing about this. So I believe it's 70 miles ish off the coast of Florida,
Yeah,
on
I've
the
been
Gulf
there,
side. On the Gulf side. And so I remember asking my dad about that. I said, who did they think was going to attack them from that vantage point?
to build
And you're
that
thinking
much.
about it's also 70 miles off the coast, so it could easily be avoided. Like you're not protecting the mainland United States with that fort. And
Yeah,
the craziest part about all of it was that there's no fresh water on that
no
island.
water. Yeah, no water. Yeah.
So okay, so now try to wrap your mind around what the purpose of this place was based on the timeline we're taught that it was built.
Yeah.
It makes no sense whatsoever. And what we're told is they sent prisoners and people like that over there to build it, and it's like the most complicated, like masonry style of how they would
Like
put the bricks
arches
together.
and all that stuff. Yeah.
It's 16. I mean, we can't even fathom 16 million bricks, but they would have had to ship the bricks 70 miles, boatloads of them. And then they did what with this place?
Nothing. Yeah. Imagine even
Nothing.
on the homeland in Florida or wherever, having to take away manpower to construct all of those bricks, right? Just to make them and then load them on a ship. And for what reason? If they're in a war, there's all this stuff going on. They definitely would have put their resources and time towards something more important, like guarding the coast or where people actually live. You know what I'm saying? It's just so these
It's
stories
all
now.
it's all it's all a lie. It's
Yeah,
all a lie. I mean, that's all you can really say is like that was there before. I don't know we don't know when that was there. We don't know who used it and for what reason. But we know that they didn't build that thing as some kind of outpost for potentially the future civil war that's going to happen. Or
yeah,
the
no. I mean,
where they call it for like basically to guard against the British. Again, it's like on the Gulf side of Florida. Like it's really not a good strategically valuable property with, like I said, with no fresh water.
yeah, I mean, you'd have to continuously have ships sail fresh water out. For what? So you're having to constantly sailing ships, bringing food, bringing water, to guard a pointless, gigantic structure that can be sailed around easily. You know what I'm saying? Because your
Can
cannon
easily be
can't fire
avoided.
that far. Yeah, what's your cannon can fire what, like a quarter mile if it's the super cannon at that time or something?
Have you watched John Levi's videos?
Yeah,
Do you
I
follow
used to
him?
watch a ton of his stuff.
Have you read his book?
I haven't read his book now.
I got his book, and he had a very interesting part, and of course, like being like me and you being local, being near each other. So we're taught about Roanoke Island. So like the mainstream history says that the first permanent British settlement was Jamestown, but they landed in Roanoke Island down somewhere like in the Outer Banks of North Carolina.
Hmm.
And so that was like the lost colony where they believed that maybe like Native Americans, Indians might have killed them. John White was like the main guy in this
Hmm.
colony. He went back to Great Britain for supplies. Well, that being said, he did these detailed maps of that area. And this was the crazy part about it. Like I'd never heard this before. I was reading the book and it was mentioning like how accurate they were from this,
Uh-huh.
so this was like the 1540s or something like that. So he made this map. Well, there was a patch over the map where these two like rivers met and they forked, and
Uh-huh.
they did some kind of like X-ray work. I'm not even sure exactly what the term would be, but they identified that what was under the patch was a star fort.
Oh,
Have you
yeah.
seen
How'd
that?
that get there?
Well, I mean, so obviously at that point, if there was a star fort before there was a permanent settlement in the New World,
Hmm.
it's all a lie. I
Yeah.
mean, that means it's likely, and I mean, it makes sense to us that these star forts were there before America didn't build that. America, like they didn't build those things after 1776. These things were there before.
Yeah, and I'll give you a bizarre thing that kind of blew my mind. So I found all these old interviews of these. I guess they were filmed in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s or something. It was these old timers who were alive during the 1800s, and they were still alive, and so they were interviewing about. One guy was a photographer, and he went across. He went out into Colorado, and he was out with all these cattle people and stuff, and he was sent to like film things like Grand Canyon and whatever, going places. And
Mm.
he's talking about his gear, and it weighed 100 pounds and how much work it was and all that. But out of all these interviews I've watched with these really old people, they don't mention anything about mud flood, which is bizarre to me because I know something happened at some point in time.
Yeah,
They don't mention certain things about the buildings. They don't mention, like, at that point in time, early 1800s, it would still be on, seems like it would be on people's minds. What's up with the orphan trains? What's up with, and they just don't mention these things, like what's up with all the, just the oddities of everything going on. And
yeah. The incubator babies at
what,
Coney Island.
yeah,
Like nobody questions that. Like that seems strange to me. Like whose kids are those?
all across the world, these orphan trains were going on. I even read something where there was just thousands of kids going through Russia onto ships going to Australia. They just shipped out thousands of children out of Russia to Australia to help populate that place. And Australia is another big lie about how they sent prisoners there. I've listened to people from Australia talking about and they're like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, how did a bunch of prisoners get here and in 40 years build this entire city?
The
Right?
real question would be, why would you ship prisoners to a giant continent? Like, to do what with them?
Not an island, a continent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge place. It's like, you think about it, it's like, so if you're the British, you could have a couple options. You could just kill them,
Yeah.
right? Or you could just stick them in all the prisons you've already got. Like, but why would you ever ship them to across the world?
Yeah.
Like to basically like the furthest reaches of the world. You ship them to this place, and then who watches them while they're there? And then what do they do? Yeah, as I say, the most obvious place is America, but yeah, Australia might be worse because there's a bunch of weird things with Australia. I saw some interesting. I read a book about this. Very interesting. There's these grid patterns in Australia where they're saying, like, if you look at like almost like satellite images, there's these lines that are dead straight and they go all the way across the country, and they actually build the roads like parallel to these straight lines. You're like, well, where did the lines come from? Another crazy thing was that we're taught about the Great Wall of China, which obviously is very suspect in itself.
It is, yeah.
But Australia has two of the biggest fences in the whole world. Like, literally, I forgot how many. It's like 5,000 kilometers or something like that. Maybe that might be a little bit much, but it's thousands of miles of a fence. They got two of them in there, and what they call it is the dingo fence. And they say they were trying to keep certain kinds of rodents or nuisance creatures. It's just like a regular fence. And so the funny part is that it's obviously a big joke there because there's obviously animals on both sides of the fences. They never worked, but still they still maintain them in Australia for whatever reason. There's also a place where they supposedly shoot off their rockets, and the place is like as big as, I think, like New Hampshire, and it's off limits to people. You can't even go there. Even though America, where we shoot off wherever our fake space program is, we don't, you can't take a whole state up to do whatever they're doing, but they do it in Australia, and you can't fly drones over there. You can't do anything. So there's a lot of weird things going on with Australia, because you think about it, like I was really shocked during like the pandemic stuff, how quickly how strict it was there, and how quickly people were just so compliant.
Oh yeah, it was like they flipped a switch.
Basically tyranny.
Yeah, and the people complied, and even the worst was how quickly the police became.
Yeah,
it was like, it's almost as if there was somebody hit some Wi-Fi switch, and it just whatever triggered certain people into becoming like compliant to tyranny.
I was surprised about that because I've I grew up as a surfer, and I've always watched like kind of like I've watched a million surf movies, and like the Australian guys were always the wildest guys, and I almost thought in my mind that these were like descendants of prisoners, and they liked to party hard. They were really unruly, so they're the last people who are going to comply with this kind of stuff. And then but it wasn't like that at all. It was the complete opposite of that.
I mean, there's people that had to leave Australia because it became so tyrannical. They just left, or they got their bank accounts froze. Like, who was it? Max Egan, was very outspoken. They froze all his accounts. I think he's been from Thailand to South America, whatever, just kind of trying to lay low and stay away. So it became, Canada was terrible too. So yeah, that's a very bizarre thing, but I can't fully explain how quickly, other than the public being completely brainwashed, MK Ultra'd into through their music and through their television shows and through the food they're eating, through the fluoride in their water, that they were easily able to take over a compliant public that when we were younger in the surf days and stuff, they would have went total Aussie nuts on them, and just had a rebellion.
You would have thought, yeah.
So,
So with all that being said, so you've made the connections here, and now you've obviously, I know I watched your, you had a pretty decent YouTube video about this where you kind of like going all through it all. You read a book about this.
Yeah.
Have you found anyone locally that that's been accepting of this besides maybe me? And obviously, you didn't meet me locally. You met me over the
Yes.
internet.
Um, so I'll give you a bizarre thing. So, every once in a while, I'd have some random item I was going to sell, on OfferUp or Facebook Marketplace, right? So
Mhm.
some item around the house, a bicycle or whatever. And so some guy would come to buy it, and you kind of chit chat for a minute, and all of a sudden you find out this guy's a Christian and he believes a lot of stuff that I believe in.
Mhm.
And I thought, oh, that's really weird because I don't meet anybody who has the same beliefs.
Yeah,
Well, and I still don't, except for when I have these bizarre connections like that. I go to sell something, and all of a sudden some guy shows up at my house to buy it or whatever, and he believes the same type of stuff I believe. And after a while, I said, well, wait a second. It's almost like there's no one else in the world. For 20 years, I've been telling people about conspiracy stuff, and nobody would listen to. They didn't want to hear it. And then all of a
yeah,
sudden, these people show up in my house, and they didn't know as much as I did on some things, but they knew, a lot. And I was like, wow, this is really weird. So, but mostly, no, I don't meet anybody. They just don't like to talk about the controversial stuff. They might talk about a conspiracy that the liberals are trying to steal an election. That's about as far as they'll get, or the bankers are trying to rip you off, or the IRS or something like that. But when you get into spiritual stuff, spiritual warfare stuff, things about knowing your enemy so you know how to fight against them, they don't want to talk about it. I think YouTube is reaching out to a lot of people now where they're like, oh, wow, maybe this is true.
I mean, I feel like that in my space, because again, I probably woke up with a generation of people. Well, surely I did. I mean, I think if you couldn't tell what was going on in 2020, I don't know what it'll take. So, but a lot of us have started started learning the truth. We started exposing things. It's been a process for all of us. But I do think that, talking about this specific subject, at first you get a lot of people resistant of it, because obviously this goes against the mainstream big time in
Don't blame them.
every way. Well, I always, and I don't give people a hard time about that, because I'm saying, like, just don't just trust me. Go look it up. I mean, like, if you think I'm wrong, go try to prove me wrong. But I have noticed there's a lot of people say this makes sense,
Yeah,
and
a
then
lot.
they're continuing to research, and there's a lot of people that this community is growing in
Yeah,
size, and I believe that the Holy Spirit's moving, and people are things that we should have always done is just question the narrative. Like, why do we believe the things we do? Why do we trust certain people? Do they have the receipts? You trust God alone, and then everybody else, you're gonna have to trust but verify, right? Like, is that the
yeah,
old Ronald Reagan slogan? Try to, like, at least let's look back at what they said. Be Bereans.
yeah.
And but I do feel like that there's a lot more of us, like, waking up each and every
There
day.
are. Yeah, there are. It's strange. It's strange, because we kind of grew up in an era where you're told to trust your doctor. Your school teacher is the
Hmm.
authority on the subject they're teaching, and it's always right. And so that was a little hard to break away from. And but like I said, it took time for me to decompress from that. And I don't know if the same thing happened to you, but it was like all of a sudden I got up one morning and I went, hey, I got lied to about everything, and this is what's really true. When it came to like the millennial kingdom and all that stuff, it's just all of a sudden one day I got it. I was like, oh, wait a second.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely with you, because I think that I was literally, because of what I started to do, like, I feel like that God gave me a platform to start talking about stuff.
Yeah,
And then I liked making videos, and I like learning stuff, and I like telling people the stuff I learned. And so
yeah,
I was kind of like just being like making daily videos, like, on TikTok. And I was, making, different conspiracies. I was like, dang. And then you get challenged about certain conspiracies, and you go look them up, and you're like, that too? My
yeah,
gosh. And so so eventually you did get to the point of, like, man, they've lied about just about everything. And then when you come to this conclusion, they all make sense why they lied about all the things, because so many of especially like biblical cosmology and stuff like that, people would say, well, why would they lie about it? Well, I can give you good reasons why they would lie about it in this context of like they don't want you to know where you live. They don't want you to know when you live.
When you
So
live, where
if
you
those
live,
things are
where you
true,
came from.
you're confused. Like we don't know which way is up. We don't know where we are on the timeline. It just like and then eventually just trust me. We're not lying to you. Like even though we know now that they are. And I said it does feel like that this really is the conspiracy. Everything else is a little tent pole inside of this big tent of all of it.
Yes, you're
And
absolutely right.
and it makes sense in this context. Otherwise, that's what I was trying to tell people that I said, you know what? I don't have all the answers about the old world and
Hmm.
potentially the mud flood. I can't explain all the buried stuff. Okay, so I want y'all to go explain it to me then. You know, like I don't know anything, and if you got a good answer, I'm willing to listen. But when you see that there's stuff buried around the whole realm, okay, so don't you think an event that's that big, the Bible has some kind of answer to it? Because I mean, this is like on the level like Armageddon. If there's an
Yeah,
earthquake or whatever caused this, I feel like that you believe in a sovereign God. You don't believe that man did this. I mean, I don't believe that man does. I don't believe that man could do that without God's,
right.
okay. So where does that put you? So that's what I'm trying to say is that we could be wrong about some of the conclusions we have. Present us more evidence. So like give us, and
Sure.
I think that's the part of like me being saying that the mainstream does not even try to explain this. Actually, I literally had a video talking about the mud flood. I made like a 5-minute reel, and I was kind of laying out all the case of saying like, yeah, this is buried. There's the Roman ruins were buried. The stuff on Eastern Islands buried. There's stuff in Iraq that's buried. There's stuff in modern cities that are buried. It's everywhere.
Mhm.
And then I got a flag misinformation. The mud flood is debunked or it's false information. I'm like, there's no evidence. I was like, I just gave you 5 minutes worth of evidence, and I'm not saying like I know exactly. I was in the video. I was literally positing the idea that it could have been a giant earthquake. And it was just me. It was my theory. So it makes sense to me. The idea of liquefaction
Yeah,
is that maybe the soil was liquefied, things sunk. I could, I'm not married to that idea. My point is, there isn't a book like you said. There's not a book. There's not a historian. There's not anybody who's credible that even admits to it. Even though, again, I was showing like evidence of like Sardis in Turkey.
yeah,
Biblical Sardis. There's these old pictures from the 1850s of like 20 columns are 20 foot tall and they're buried under the ground. There's
yeah.
that gate in Iraq, like famous, it's got like these cherub looking
Mm.
creatures with the long beards. 1850, it's a 25-foot tall gate. It's literally 100% buried under the
There,
ground in
yeah.
1850.
Hmm.
And so,
Yeah,
okay, so all right, so how did that happen? I
yeah.
mean, I'm willing to listen. Like I would love to hear a reasonable explanation of how that happened. I don't know.
All I can come up is theories. One of the theories is, I have, you've probably seen old maps where it shows California as an island, like 1500s or so.
Yes.
And so it's possible that the whole Pangia thing, when there used to be one large continent and then things spread out, it's
Hmm.
possible that that is where the mud flood took place. I can't prove that. It might sound crazy, but that would indicate why everything seems to be homogeneous with the buildings and everything being linked. Traveling from one landmass to another in connections, and then if the lands spread out rapidly from each other, then that would create like a huge earthquake type effect, mud burying everything, whatever. Um, but just bizarre to me, there's no writings. There's not a book. There's no information, not even a hint of this worldwide cataclysm that had to kill off mass amount of people and bury the vegetation and
Hmm.
people starving. There's not a single book about it. That's weird. It's weird, man.
And I think that's what I'm saying is like, I think that's why it's interesting to have these conversations because I think you're like a lot of people. Yeah. And my buddy Vitali Alpha Talks, he's he's the first one I heard that theory from that he believed that Pangea was real, but maybe it's not as old. It's not old like they say it is. Maybe it's more recent event. Yeah, the splitting of it. And I mean, obviously that sounds crazy, but But again, everything sounds crazy. You know what sounds crazy is believing that they built a 16 million brick fort in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico for some reason, like that. So that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
So Pangia idea sounds less stupid to me every day when I hear stuff like that. That's what we're taught as
That
actual
what
history.
I just said will make the average, scientific person who's listened, who really trusts the science, and that will make them angry, and they'll have 1,000 reasons explaining how that's not possible. It happened. But like a lot of things, they're basing all of their information, just like people that believe NASA, they're all their information, they're basing it off the belief system that nobody ever lied to them about the core of science and history and evolutionary
Right.
stuff they were taught. They they believe all that's true enough to build their theory upon it like it's fact. And just like me, a long time ago, I would have accepted this. I would think it was heresy or something. People need time to decompress and really look at it. They may be laying in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, maybe that is possible. I don't know. But they will get mad about that subject and have lots of things to say, I'm sure, but I'm used to it.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you, brother. I think that I honestly, I feel like that at this point, I really don't. I don't worry about too much about what the other people. I mean, I feel like that. God knows our hearts. Like He knows why we want to know. I think we're not saying these things because there's a monetary gain to having crazy theory. I mean, there can be, but I mean, like that's not the reason I did this. I
No.
said, obviously, I've told people. I said, if I was gonna lie to people for money, I'd be telling them that I'd be date setting of the rapture all the time, because
Yeah,
you
I'd
see
be
those
writing a
people
book
do
about when the
very
rapture.
well. I'd be talking about living your best life now. I'd be talking about all the kinds of things that all the TV preachers do, but we don't, because that's not. This is obviously it's gaining momentum. I think just because people have the same questions as us, and I think that the cool thing is I feel like that in this space, as you were saying, like you made the same connections with Genesis 6, the megaliths. I did too.
Yeah.
There's thirst for like these questions of like, okay, so if the aliens didn't build these things, then who did? Okay,
Yeah.
so if you don't buy that the horse and buggy people built these old world buildings, well, then who did? And so if Christians are without answers, these people are going to go get answers from somebody else.
Yeah.
And I feel like that I said at least we are trying our best to, with a biblical understanding, with God's word being the rock that we're building our houses on. We are trying to explain it with a biblical worldview.
Hmm.
And I think that I'm good with standing in front of my creator one day saying that I was trying my best, and I was definitely not saying trust me, bro. I was saying like this is my best. This is my best guess here.
Yeah. You and I are both on the same page where there's so many mysteries to the point where they've stacked on top of each other so high that the statistical probability of the fake narrative stories that are telling us are a joke anymore. It's like not even
Hmm.
it's not you I don't care what science you try to throw or what studies you've done theologically. There's so much evidence now that you can physically look at that the statistical probability weighs in the favor of what we're talking about, I believe.
I'm with you. Well, anyways, Daniel, it was awesome having you on here. Hey, please tell people where they can find you. Obviously, we only kind of scratched the surface of this because again, this is a pretty broad topic, but we'll definitely have to do this again. Tell people where they can get more information about this and where they can find you online.
Okay, so on YouTube, Sons of Light Training is the YouTube page. And I have a book that covers all the kind of the subjects we have been talking about, but it goes into the things you can't mention online without getting banned or cut off and stuff like that. And so that's called Reason to Believe by Daniel Collier. And you can find that on Amazon. So it's a big 8.5 by 11 book, large pictures in it. And, I wrote the book so that it will help awaken people. And they can also use it to help other people understand that the things that we are talking about today actually have some validity to it, to where you're like, oh, wow, that's actually believable. So that's what that's all.
Well, that's awesome, man. Yeah. So once again, I'll have your links in the description. So like, if you guys want to check out his YouTube channel, you want to check out the book, I'll have the links in there. But man, like I said, really appreciate you having you on the show. Thanks you for coming on, and we'll do it again for sure.
Yeah, I had fun. Thanks. I look forward to coming back and talking some more. I love, you don't get to talk to too many people who kind of really get it. So it was good. Thank you.
Appreciate it. God bless all y'all.
All right. See you. Bye.